In a small town at the edge of nowhere, 80-year-old Mrs. Fields spent her days alone in a creaky old house. Her hands shook slightly, and her eyesight wasn't as sharp as it once had been, but she remained self-sufficient. She'd known loneliness since her husband passed 5 years prior, leaving behind the faint smell of tobacco and the warmest memories of a love that had lasted 55 years. Her only family was her son Michael, who had moved across the country to pursue a demanding career. Busy with meetings, deadlines, and traveling, he often went weeks without calling her. Mrs. Fields tried to understand, blaming herself for being too old-fashioned to keep up with technology, too slow to respond to his quick messages. Each week, she'd write him a letter by hand. She took great care with these letters, sitting by her window with a cup of tea, watching the seasons change while she poured her thoughts onto the paper. They were filled with simple things, memories from her own youth, the way the town had changed, or sometimes the weather. She told him about the neighbors and the garden she tended daily, hoping one day he might remember that little garden from his childhood and come back to see it in full bloom. One cold autumn day, Mrs. Fields finished a letter she felt was special. She wrote about her health, mentioning the ache in her chest that had lingered for weeks. She didn't want to worry him, so she wrote it gently, almost playfully, hoping he might realize she wasn't as strong as she used to be. She posted the letter, picturing him reading it, imagining that it might tug at his heart. Days turned to weeks. She checked the mailbox every day, hoping for a response. Then, one morning, her mailbox held a letter from Michael's office. With a trembling hand, she opened it, only to find a brief note from his assistant, apologizing and explaining that Michael had passed away in an accident just days before her last letter arrived. The assistant had found her address and felt she deserved to know. Mrs. Fields crumpled to the ground, the letter slipping from her fingers. It was only now, sitting there alone, that she realized her son had loved her, even if he hadn't had the time to show it. She thought of her last letter, still unread, carrying words of love and longing that would never reach him. In the months that followed, Mrs. Fields continued writing, addressing each letter to Michael and setting them in a small box by her bedside. And though she knew he'd never read them, she couldn't stop writing, because it was the only way she still had left to feel close to him. This story captures a poignant sense of loss and the bittersweet memories that keep Mrs. Fields going, illustrating how love persists even beyond final goodbyes.